Welcome to Moonlight Tales by Crawford. Please subscribe for more. Thank you. Nelson Stone had seen it all. The glitzy parties, the expensive cars, the beautiful women, his life was a whirlwind of wealth and power. At 38, he was used to controlling everything around him, from the boardroom to his personal space. But nothing could have prepared him for the moment that would change everything. The grand estate he called home was quiet, as it often was during the late afternoon. He'd just returned from a long meeting and walked through the grand entrance, expecting peace and solitude. What he didn't expect was the sound of running water coming from the hallway leading to the private bathroom upstairs. He was used to the house staff being meticulous, always a step ahead of him. Yet, as he climbed the stairs, the unmistakable sound of splashing water caught his attention. Without thinking, he opened the door. The sight that greeted him sent a jolt through his chest. Standing in front of the fogged-up bathroom mirror was Emma, his maid. But this was no ordinary sight. She was completely open, her skin glistening with water droplets, her back to him as she carefully wiped away the steam from the mirror. Her hair, wet and messy, cascaded down her shoulders in a tangled, it made him freeze on the spot. Her presence was unguarded, a side of Emma he'd never seen before. She was usually all business, her face always covered by the ever-present expression of a servant's duty. Yet in this moment, she was open, vulnerable, something that made his breath catch. The seconds seemed to stretch, each one intensifying the tension in the air. Emma had no idea he was there, lost in her own reflection. He swallowed hard, but the words he meant to speak never came. Instead, he stared at her, unable to look away. When she finally turned, their eyes met. The shock on her face mirrored his, but there was something else, something deeper. A flicker of recognition, of something unspoken. I'm so sorry, Nelson managed, his voice strained. His heart pounded. He hadn't expected this moment, this tension. He had expected to walk in, make himself known, and retreat to his office. But now, standing in front of her, he felt exposed in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Emma's cheeks flushed a deep crimson as she quickly grabbed a towel and wrapped it around herself. Mr. Stone, I didn't know you were home. Her eyes flicked to the ground in embarrassment, but something in her gaze, something unspoken, lingered in the air. There was no going back from this moment. Nelson knew that. The encounter, awkward and accidental as it was, had awoken something in him, a feeling he couldn't quite name. I didn't mean to intrude, he said, his voice softer now. I should have knocked. But the damage was done. The air between them felt charged. Emma, still visibly flustered, moved to step past him. I'll go. I'm so sorry, Mr. Stone. But Nelson stepped into her path, blocking her exit. For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a voice low and tinged with an unfamiliar intensity, he spoke. Why do you always hide, Emma? She blinked, confusion written on her face. What do you mean? Prepared. Nelson nodded, his throat tight. I'll see you later. He couldn't think of anything else to say. He needed space. He needed to get out of the room, away from her, away from the feelings he couldn't begin to understand. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the bathroom, his mind swirling with thoughts that made no sense. As he descended the stairs, the unsettling mix of guilt and desire gnawed at him. He couldn't explain it, couldn't justify why the image of her, bare and unguarded, played over and over in his mind. He couldn't dismiss how her vulnerability had ignited something deep inside him. He stepped into his office, the room he used to retreat into, the one place he could usually shut everything else out. But not today. Today, everything felt off. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to focus on the stack of papers in front of him, but it was no use. His thoughts kept returning to Emma, her skin, the way the towel had clung to her, the way she looked when their eyes had locked, that brief moment when everything else had faded away. He told himself it was just a fleeting feeling, something to shake off. She was his employee, after all. Nothing more. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. He couldn't stop thinking about her. The image of her vulnerability haunted him, and a strange obsession began to form in his mind. He found himself imagining what it would be like to get closer to her, not just as the maid in his household, but as someone more. The idea unsettled him, yet he couldn't push it away. Hours passed. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across his office, but Nelson barely noticed. His thoughts were consumed by her, Emma, the maid. He stood up suddenly, feeling the weight of his indecision pressing down on him. What was he doing? What did he even want from her? His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his reverie. He glanced at it, but he didn't recognize the name on the screen. It was an email from his lawyer about a new business venture he was involved in, but it couldn't have felt more irrelevant in that moment. Nelson put the phone down and walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling grounds of his estate. He needed to clear his head. This was becoming something more than he was prepared for, and the last thing he wanted was to make a mistake that would change everything, everything. But what if it wasn't a mistake? What if it was something deeper? He closed his eyes, but Emma's face was there, just as vivid as before. Her expression, half shocked, half confused, was imprinted on his mind. What is happening to me? Before he could wrestle with the feeling any longer, his thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Mr. Stone. It was Emma's voice. Nelson's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly composed himself, though his mind was still a tangled mess. Yes, come in. The door opened slowly, and there she stood, looking just as composed as ever. Despite the tension from earlier. Her eyes, however, told a different story. They were softer, more vulnerable than before, and Nelson found himself momentarily lost in them. I wanted to apologize, she said quietly, her voice steady but still laced with hesitation. For earlier. It was unprofessional, and I shouldn't have. I didn't mean for that to happen. Nelson took a deep breath. He didn't want to feel sorry for her, he didn't want to give her the impression that he thought any less of her. But the truth was, he wasn't angry. Far from it. Emma, it's all right, he said softly, his voice surprisingly gentle. It was an accident. No harm done. But Emma didn't look convinced. She stepped further into the room, her eyes glancing around the space as if she was searching for something. She was close now, too close for comfort. I wanted to make sure you were okay, Nelson added, though even he wasn't sure why he said it. He couldn't explain it. This wasn't supposed to be his concern. Yet, somehow, it was. Emma didn't answer immediately. She just stood there, the silence between them growing thicker, as if it was only a matter of time before everything changed. And in that moment, Nelson knew, whatever was happening between them, however it might be, was something he couldn't walk away from. The air in Nelson's office was thick, suffocating in its silence. Emma stood there, just beyond the door, her presence both an intrusion and an unspoken invitation to something neither of them was prepared for. The tension in the room seemed to pulse with each breath they took, as if the walls themselves held their collective anxieties. She stood there, looking at him with a cautious expression, her eyes not quite meeting his. Her body was poised, but there was a subtle trembling to her stance, the kind of subtlety that made Nelson acutely aware of how much she was holding back. The apology had been offered, too quickly, perhaps, and now there was nothing left but the weight of the unspoken. He was the master of his domain, the ruler of a world built on control. But Emma had broken through the invisible barriers he had spent years perfecting. He was no longer sure who was in control of this conversation, or even of his own emotions. He glanced at her again, her features still flushed from the earlier encounter, the way her wet hair clung to the sides of her face, her eyes darting nervously to the corners of the room anywhere but at him. I wasn't angry, Nelson said softly, breaking the silence. His voice was steady but carried an undercurrent of something raw, something unexpected. I just didn't expect that. Emma nodded but didn't respond immediately. She seemed to struggle with the right words, her fingers tugging nervously at the towel wrapped tightly around her body. I should have been more careful, she said quietly, finally meeting his gaze. Her voice was small, tentative. I never meant for you to see you. Nelson finished for her. His words hung in the air, charged with something neither of them fully understood. The words felt sharper than he intended. It's fine. Really. Emma's eyes lingered on his face, a flicker of confusion passing through them. I'm not like that. I don't normally. I know, he cut in. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't need an explanation, not now. Not when his mind was consumed with thoughts that were spiraling out of control. You don't owe me an explanation. The words fell flat between them. It was clear neither of them was willing to walk away from this moment. Nelson felt the pull, the attraction that had snuck up on him, clawing at the edges of his rational mind. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain detached, but the lines had blurred. For reasons he couldn't yet explain, something in her vulnerability had drawn him in, something powerful, magnetic. Emma seemed to sense the change in the air, too. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, unsure of what to do with herself now that the awkwardness had passed. She glanced at the door again, as if calculating how quickly she could leave without making this moment worse. But Nelson couldn't let her leave, not yet. Stay, he said, his voice more commanding than he meant it to be. I don't want you to leave. Her eyes widened at his words. She opened her mouth, but then stopped, unsure of how to respond. For a moment, they just stood there, locked in a strange, silent standoff. Finally, she exhaled and stepped inside, closing the door behind her with an almost imperceptible click. The room felt smaller now, with the two of them standing in the center of it. Nelson's gaze never left her, studying her as if seeing her for the first time. There was something vulnerable in her presence, something unpolished, pure. It struck him in a way he wasn't used to. He sat down behind his desk, leaning back in his chair, trying to regain some semblance of control. The old Nelson would have let her leave without a second thought. But this, whatever this was, had pushed him past the point of no return. Sit, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Emma hesitated before moving to the chair, her movement slow, almost deliberate. She sat, but the distance between them felt far more. The silence grew between them, thick and almost suffocating. Nelson wondered if she could feel the same pull he did. But he didn't dare ask. I'm not usually this unprofessional, Emma finally spoke, breaking the silence, though her voice was still quiet, almost apologetic. I know my place here. I didn't expect you to be home. Nelson raised an eyebrow, studying her carefully. I know you didn't. But you don't have to explain yourself. It was an accident. Her eyes flickered, a brief, uncertain smile playing at the corner of her lips. Thank you, she whispered. She paused, her fingers nervously fiddling with the edge of the towel. I didn't mean to make things awkward. The air between them shifted again, becoming heavy with unspoken words. Nelson knew he was being unfair. He had no right to ask her to stay, no right to make her feel like she owed him anything. But something in her had ignited something in him that he couldn't easily quench. Emma, he began, his voice lower than before, quieter, why do you stay here? Why do you stay with me? You could go anywhere, do anything, and yet you're here. She stiffened slightly at the question, but she didn't pull away. Her eyes met his again, her expression guarded. I stay because it's what I've always known. I need the job, Mr. Stone. It's not easy for someone like me to get ahead. Nelson studied her intently. Someone like you? She looked away, her cheeks flushed once more. Yes. Someone who doesn't have a lot of options. Someone who doesn't fit in the circles you run in. I'm just a maid. That's all. Her words stung more than Nelson cared to admit. His world, his empire, had always been about wealth and status. He'd never truly understood what it was like to live outside that bubble. But something about her humility, her quiet strength, resonated with him in ways he didn't understand. She wasn't just his maid. She was someone with hopes and fears, desires and dreams, things he had never bothered to see before. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with intent. Don't sell yourself short. You're more than that. More than just someone who serves. Emma shook her head, a sad smile pulling at her lips. It doesn't matter. This is my life. It's just the way it is. Nelson sat back, his mind racing. There was something in her words that tugged at him, something that made him want to prove her wrong. He didn't know what to say next. He didn't know where this strange attraction to her was leading, but he knew one thing for certain, he couldn't let it go. This was only the beginning. The moment passed, but the energy it left behind clung to Nelson like smoke after a fire. As Emma stood and excused herself, quietly slipping out of his office, Nelson remained still, his eyes fixed on the door long after it had closed. He ran a hand over his jaw, frustrated with himself. What the hell was that? He thought. This wasn't how he operated. He didn't get distracted, and certainly not by women in his employ. He was meticulous, calculated. There was a reason people feared him in the boardroom, he didn't mix business with emotion. But Emma had walked in, wrapped only in a towel and uncertainty, and had disarmed him in seconds. He stood and moved to the window, looking out over the manicured gardens that surrounded his estate. The glass reflected back a man who suddenly felt like a stranger. One look, just one accidental glimpse, and something had shifted inside him. Not lust. Not fully. No, this felt different. It was like something had cracked open inside his chest, something he didn't know had been locked away. Downstairs, Emma moved quickly through the hallway, her heart still thudding against her ribs like it wanted to escape. Her hands were damp, her skin still tingling with embarrassment. But beneath that embarrassment was something else, an unsettling warmth she didn't want to acknowledge. Why did he look at me like that? She shook the thought away. No. Don't go there, Emma. You work for him. That's it. Nothing more. She slipped into the staff quarters and locked the door behind her. Then leaned against it, exhaling long and slow. Her legs felt weak, her thoughts scattered. The look in Nelson Stone's eyes had burned through her, a mix of curiosity, confusion, and something far more dangerous. She buried her face in her hands. He probably thinks I'm careless, unprofessional. Maybe he'll fire me. That thought made her stomach drop. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not with her sister's school fees and her mother's medications back home. She had responsibilities. And yet, the moment lingered. That night, Nelson barely slept. He lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the memory of Emma's startled expression, her flushed skin, her bare shoulders, all of it replaying in his mind on an endless loop. But it wasn't just her beauty. It was her vulnerability. Her strength, even in her embarrassment. The way she didn't crumble beneath his gaze. She intrigued him. He tried to shake it. She's just your maid. You pay her. That's the line. But some lines, he was beginning to realize, weren't as fixed as he once believed. The next morning came with its usual routines. The staff moved quietly through the house, setting up breakfast, tidying the grand halls. Nelson sat at the end of the dining table, sipping his black coffee, his newspaper untouched. His mind wasn't on business today. He heard her before he saw her. The soft footfalls of Emma entering the room, her eyes respectfully downcast as she approached with the tray of warm pastries. She didn't look at him. Didn't speak. Just set the tray down with careful precision. "Good morning," Nelson said, his voice a little softer than usual. Emma paused, clearly surprised, before finally meeting his gaze. "Good morning, sir." He studied her. She looked composed, but there was a tightness around her eyes, a tension in her jaw. She was putting up walls, and he couldn't blame her. "How are you feeling?" he asked. She blinked. "I'm fine, thank you." "I hope you're not uncomfortable," he added. "About yesterday." Her hands fidgeted slightly, then she quickly clasped them together. "I'm here to do my job, Mr. Stone. That's what I'm focused on." Nelson nodded slowly, unsure if he admired her composure or hated it for being so final. He wanted to say more. Ask more. But he didn't. Not yet. Over the next few weeks, nothing outwardly changed between them. And yet, everything was changing. Emma noticed how Nelson's eyes lingered a little longer whenever they crossed paths. How he no longer ignored her presence like he used to. He spoke more, brief, courteous comments that always carried weight. And every time she was near, there was this unspoken hum in the air, like something waiting to spark. For Nelson, Emma became an unexpected distraction. He found excuses to pass through the kitchen when he knew she'd be there. He watched her from afar, sweeping the marble floors, polishing the antiques, arranging fresh flowers. She moved with quiet grace, never drawing attention, but never quite invisible either. He started asking himself questions he'd never asked before. What's her story? What does she dream about? What makes her laugh? The more he noticed, the more he realized how little he knew about her. And the more he wanted to. One afternoon, as Emma knelt in the garden trimming hedges, Nelson stood on the balcony above, watching. The sun lit up her skin in gold, and she wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. She looked so real. So human. So far removed from the artificial women who populated his world. Later that evening, he called out to her as she passed the hallway. "Emma." She turned, her eyes wide, cautious. "Yes, sir." "Join me for tea." There was a beat of silence. She looked around, unsure. "Sir." "I'd like your company," he said plainly. "Nothing formal. Just a cup of tea." She hesitated. And then she nodded. "All right." Emma stood frozen for a moment, surprised by the casual request. It wasn't that Nelson Stone was known for his kindness, but there was something in the way he said it, almost gentle, almost inviting. The few times they'd spoken before had always been brief, professional, and to the point. But this felt different. She nodded again, but the unease still lingered beneath her skin. She wasn't sure if she should go, but something told her that turning him down would be a mistake. Her mind raced. This is a test, Emma. A test of boundaries. Don't let him think you're just a maid. With a small breath, she straightened her posture and made her way to the study where Nelson had invited her. The room was quiet when she entered, the heavy curtains drawn to let in the soft evening light. Nelson stood by the fireplace, one of his rare smiles tugging at the corner of his lips as he looked up at her. It was almost unsettling how differently he looked when he wasn't wearing the cold, commanding facade he wore in meetings or boardrooms. In this space, he appeared almost approachable. "Please, sit," he gestured to the armchair across from him. The tea was already on a small, low table between them, 2 cups of steaming chamomile, a touch of honey beside the pot. He didn't seem to expect her to speak first, so she sat down, watching him carefully. "You've never had tea with me before," he said, breaking the silence. "I thought it might be nice to share one for a change." Emma nodded, but her heart fluttered. She wasn't sure where this conversation was going, or why it felt so charged. She had spent years learning to control her emotions, keeping everything neatly tucked away. But now, sitting here, it was harder to keep the walls up. "I usually take mine with a little sugar," she said, her voice soft, almost too quiet. It was an unremarkable thing to say, but she needed something to ground herself in the moment. Stay calm. It's just tea. Nelson poured her cup with a fluid motion and added a spoonful of sugar, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He placed the cup in front of her, his fingers brushing lightly against hers for a brief moment. She felt the touch, electric, subtle, but it made her pulse race. "This is different," she said, still avoiding looking directly at him. Her eyes remained fixed on the steam rising from her cup. She wanted to hide behind the ritual of tea, but she could feel the weight of his gaze on her, like he was studying her. "I thought it might be," Nelson said, his tone thoughtful. He paused for a moment before continuing, his voice quieter, more reflective. "You've been here for a while now, haven't you?" Emma's eyes flicked up to meet his. "A year, sir." "And in that year, have you ever had a moment to enjoy yourself?" Nelson asked, his voice softer than usual. There was no condescension in his tone, only genuine curiosity. Emma was taken aback by the question. No one had ever asked her anything like that before, certainly not with such earnestness. Her life had been about surviving, doing the job well enough to keep her place, to support her family. But enjoying herself? "I don't really think about it," she replied honestly. "I just do what needs to be done." Nelson's eyes darkened slightly as he set his cup down, never taking his gaze off her. Maybe that's the problem. The comment was casual, but it lingered in the air, a weight she couldn't ignore. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Was he implying that her life was incomplete because of her job? Or was he trying to get under her skin, like all the others who'd passed through this estate? The question was too complex, too loaded for her to answer. For the next several minutes, the conversation flowed uneasily between them, small talk, questions about her family, her hometown, nothing too personal. The silence that had initially been uncomfortable began to settle into a rhythm. It was only after they both finished their tea that Nelson broke the lull. "I want to know more about you, Emma," he said, his tone direct, but not harsh. "You've worked here for a long time now. But you're not like the other staff." She stiffened slightly. "I'm just a maid, Mr. Stone." "You're more than that," Nelson replied, leaning back in his chair, his eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "I can see it in the way you carry yourself. You're different. You have a kind of presence, an intelligence. Most people, they just fade into the background." Emma felt a slight blush creeping up her neck, but she refused to let herself be affected. "I do my job. I'm not here to stand out." Nelson's gaze softened for a brief moment before he spoke again. "But you are standing out, whether you realize it or not. And that's why I'm asking you to sit with me now, why I'm offering you tea. I want to understand you better." His words settled heavily over her. The idea that someone like Nelson Stone, someone so powerful, so commanding, would seek to know her, to understand her, felt like a strange, dangerous game. And yet, she couldn't shake the pull she felt toward him. But just as quickly, the moment passed. She stood and gathered herself, wanting to maintain control. "Thank you for the tea, sir," she said, her voice steady, even though her heart still raced. "You're welcome, Emma," he replied, his voice almost reluctant as he stood with her. "I think we'll have more of these conversations, won't we?" She didn't respond immediately. There was something in his words that made her uncertain. He wasn't just offering her tea anymore. He was offering her a window into his world. And she wasn't sure if she wanted to look. But still, she nodded once. "I'll see you tomorrow, sir." And with that, she left the study, the taste of tea still on her lips and the weight of his words in her mind. The door clicked shut behind her, and Nelson stood there, staring after her for a long moment. His eyes were focused, calculating. He was no fool. He could see it now, the complexity in her, the way she held herself, the spark that had always been there beneath her composed exterior. It was just a cup of tea. But something about that moment, had changed everything, the days following the tea seemed to blur together, a haze of routine and unspoken words hanging thick between Emma and Nelson. Each time she crossed paths with him, there was an almost magnetic pull that neither of them acknowledged, but both felt. She had returned to her duties as usual, polishing the silver, cleaning the floors, ensuring the grand house remained immaculate, but it was no longer the same. The air felt heavier when he was near, and her thoughts were often interrupted by a flash of his intense, unreadable gaze. But Nelson, ever the master of control, gave nothing away. To the outside world, he was as composed as ever. Yet, Emma couldn't help but sense that he was constantly watching her, waiting for something she herself couldn't define. It was a Thursday morning when it happened again. She was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for the household staff, when Nelson appeared in the doorway. His presence, always imposing, seemed to fill the room more than usual today. Emma glanced up briefly before returning to her work, pretending not to notice the way his eyes lingered on her. "Good morning," he said, his voice cool but carrying an edge of something else, something darker. He stepped inside, crossing the threshold with deliberate ease. "Good morning, sir," she replied without looking up. "I've been meaning to ask you," he started, but his words trailed off as he watched her hands move with such precision, the quiet focus with which she worked. For a moment, the tension between them seemed to stretch, almost palpable. Emma set down the knife she was using to slice vegetables and turned to face him. "Yes, Mr. Stone. I'm planning a charity event next week," he continued. "I'd like you to be there. We'll need a few extra hands, and I think you'd be a valuable addition." His words were measured, but there was something in his tone, a challenge, perhaps. Or an invitation. Emma hesitated, unsure of what to say. Her position was clear, her role well defined. She wasn't supposed to mix with the high society Nelson surrounded himself with, let alone be an active part of such an event. "I don't think that would be appropriate, sir," she replied, keeping her voice steady. Nelson took a step forward, his face unreadable. "And why is that?" The question was simple enough, yet something in the way he asked it felt almost like a command. He was testing her, pushing her boundaries. "I'm a maid," Emma said, almost apologetically. "It wouldn't be right for me to attend an event like that." For the first time, Nelson's expression softened. His usual imperious demeanor seemed to crack just slightly, and for a brief, fleeting moment, he looked thoughtful. "You're more than just a maid, Emma." She felt the familiar knot in her stomach tighten at the way he said her name, so casually, as if they were equals. She was no fool. She knew exactly what he was trying to do. But something in the way he spoke, like he truly saw her as more, made her heart flutter in spite of herself. "I don't know about that," she said quietly, turning back to the counter. The room felt suddenly too small, too confined. Nelson's footsteps echoed behind her as he walked towards the door. But just before he exited, he turned back. "I'll expect you to come, Emma. I'll send you the details." And with that, he was gone, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the faint, persistent feeling that she was being drawn into something she wasn't sure she understood. The following days were filled with the usual hustle and bustle of the Stone estate, but there was a new tension in the air. Emma found herself thinking about Nelson far more than she ever had before. She couldn't shake the feeling that his gaze was always on her, watching, waiting for something. The idea of the charity event lingered in the back of her mind. Despite her best efforts to avoid it, she couldn't deny the curiosity that gnawed at her. She had spent most of her life hidden in the shadows, cleaning up after people like Nelson, never allowed to participate in their world. And now, he was insisting she step into it, not as a servant, but as something different. The night before the event, Emma stood before her small mirror in the room she shared with the other staff members. She had never owned anything extravagant, her clothes always practical, often worn from years of use. But Nelson had asked her to attend, and for some reason, she found herself contemplating whether or not she should make an effort. She chose a simple but elegant black dress, something understated but not too plain. It was a reflection of who she was, someone who had always blended into the background, yet now she was beginning to question that very nature. She stared at her reflection for a long time, the unfamiliarity of the situation making her heart race. Could she truly walk into that world, side by side with Nelson? The next evening, she arrived at the event. The grand ballroom was buzzing with the chatter of the city's elite, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the clink of crystal glasses. Nelson was easy to spot, towering above the crowd in a perfectly tailored suit, his every movement commanding attention. He looked different. Not the austere, cold billionaire she was used to seeing, but a man who belonged here, moving through the world with ease. When he saw her, his expression flickered. A brief flash of something, surprise, approval, crossed his face before he quickly masked it with a smile. Emma felt herself stiffen under his gaze, unsure of how to behave, how to move in this world that wasn't hers. But as he approached her, there was no judgment in his eyes, no condescension, only the same piercing gaze he had when they'd shared tea days ago. "You made it," he said, his voice low, almost intimate. "I'm glad." Emma nodded, her heart beating in her chest. "I didn't think it was appropriate, but, you insisted." Nelson smiled, a small, private smile that made her pulse quicken. "Good. You're here because I want you here. That's all that matters." She wasn't sure if she should be comforted by that or unsettled, but before she could respond, a servant approached, offering them drinks. Nelson took a glass of champagne and held it out to her. "Join me for a drink?" he asked, his voice almost like a dare. Emma hesitated but accepted. The night was just beginning, and she had no idea what it would lead to. But the pull of his presence was undeniable, and she found herself stepping further into his world, no longer just the maid but something else, something new, something fragile. The music of the charity event was loud in her ears, but all Emma could hear was the soft beat of her heart as she held the champagne glass in her hand. Nelson stood before her, his posture as commanding as always, but his eyes, those eyes, had a certain softness she had never noticed before. "Do you enjoy the event, Emma?" he asked, his voice lowering slightly, as if he were trying to draw her into a private conversation amid the grand affair. The glimmer of the chandeliers above illuminated his face, casting a warm glow over his sharp features. For a moment, she forgot they were surrounded by the city's elite. It felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them. It's not what I expected," Emma admitted, her eyes flicking nervously over the room. There were conversations happening all around her, but they felt like distant echoes. Nelson had asked her to attend as if it were a casual request. She hadn't realized until now just how out of place she truly felt. "Most people don't," Nelson said with a soft chuckle. He glanced at the crowd before turning back to her. "But you belong here, Emma. More than you think." She swallowed at the weight of his words. It wasn't just flattery, there was sincerity in his tone that unsettled her. His words felt like a subtle challenge, one she wasn't sure she was ready to face. "Why did you ask me to come?" Emma's voice was barely above a whisper, and even she was surprised by the directness of the question. It had been on her mind since he'd extended the invitation, and now, she couldn't hold it back. Nelson studied her for a moment, the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Because I believe everyone has a place, even if they don't see it themselves. And I wanted to see you here. In this world, with me." Emma's pulse quickened, the way his gaze lingered on her making her stomach flutter. She wanted to look away, to break the intensity of the moment, but she found herself unable to. "You don't think I should be here," she said, her voice tinged with self-doubt. Nelson shook his head slowly. "No, Emma. That's not it. I think you're more than you give yourself credit for." His words wrapped around her like a blanket, warm and comforting, yet strangely unsettling. She wasn't used to hearing such things, especially from someone like him, a man who could have anything, anyone, yet was offering her his attention in a way that felt far too personal. Later that evening, after the event had wound down, Nelson offered to escort her back to the staff quarters. "You don't have to," Emma said, her voice hesitant as she adjusted the fabric of her dress. "I can walk myself." But Nelson wouldn't hear of it. "It's late. And besides, I'm not the kind of man who leaves someone to fend for themselves in a world that's unfamiliar." They walked in silence through the grand corridors, the soft echo of their footsteps mingling with the distant hum of the estate's nightlife. Emma felt her nerves rise again. The feeling of being so close to him, to a man who was so far out of her league, was overwhelming. She could hear the faint rustle of his suit with every step, feel the warmth of his presence at her side. As they reached the door to the staff area, Nelson stopped and turned to face her. His expression was softer than she had ever seen it, and for a moment, she thought he might say something more, something that could change everything between them. But he didn't. He simply looked at her, his gaze lingering, as if searching for something in her eyes. "Good night, Emma," he said, his voice low and gentle. "Good night, Mr. Stone," she replied. Heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. With one last lingering glance, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with a mixture of confusion and longing. She wasn't sure what had just happened, whether it was an invitation for more or just a fleeting moment of politeness, but one thing was certain, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something she wasn't prepared for. The next few days passed in a blur. Emma threw herself into her work as usual, focusing on the tasks at hand, trying to push the growing confusion about Nelson to the back of her mind. But every time she saw him, every time their eyes met across a room, it felt like an invisible thread was pulling them together. It was on one of those days, while she was polishing the grand staircase, that she heard him approaching. His footsteps were heavy, purposeful, and they reverberated through the large hallway. "Emma," Nelson's voice called, and she immediately straightened, turning to face him. "Yes, sir." He paused for a moment, his gaze sweeping over her. It was as if he were seeing her for the first time all over again, really seeing her. His eyes lingered on her face, as though trying to understand the woman beneath the maid's uniform. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice a little softer than usual, "perhaps we could spend some time together. Outside of work. Away from all this." He gestured vaguely to the opulence of the mansion. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what to make of his offer. Was it an attempt to get closer to her? Or was he just being kind, out of some misplaced sense of duty? "I don't think that's appropriate, Mr. Stone," she said quickly, lowering her gaze to the floor, suddenly feeling small under his intense stare. Nelson's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "I don't think that's for you to decide, Emma. I'm inviting you, not because you're my employee, but because I'd like to know you. As a person." She looked up at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "Why?" His eyes darkened slightly, and for a moment, Emma could have sworn she saw something vulnerable in them, something she had never expected from a man who had everything. "Because you intrigue me. And, because I want to understand you. I want to know why you fight so hard against being seen." Emma felt the truth in his words, the weight of them. She had always hidden herself in plain sight, never allowing anyone to truly look at her, never allowing herself to be seen. And yet, here was Nelson, offering her something more than she had ever imagined. The question was, could she take that step? Could she let herself be seen? Let him see her? She took a deep breath, her decision hanging in the balance. Emma stood there, frozen, as Nelson's words lingered in the air between them. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, a mixture of excitement and fear flooding her. For a moment, she struggled to keep her emotions in check. She wasn't used to this, being seen, truly seen by someone like him. But there was something about Nelson's presence, the way he looked at her, that made her feel like she could take that step. The question was whether she had the courage to. I don't know," Emma finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Her hands were clenched by her sides, her body tense. I've always kept myself hidden, kept my distance. I don't think I can just change. Nelson's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, she saw something raw in his eyes, a flicker of understanding. He stepped a little closer, his footsteps light on the marble floor, and she felt her breath catch in her throat as he reached out, his hand hovering just a few inches away from her arm. You don't have to change, Emma, he said, his voice soothing, almost gentle. You just have to let me see you for who you really are. That's all I'm asking. The sincerity in his voice made her heart ache. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let herself believe that someone like Nelson could care about her beyond the role she played in his world. But the thought of opening up, of allowing herself to be vulnerable, terrified her. I don't belong in your world, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know how to fit in. I don't know how to be anything but this. Nelson's gaze never wavered, and there was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet persistence. You're wrong, Emma. You belong more than you think. Don't let fear decide who you are. Let me help you. There it was again, the invitation. The promise of something more, something beyond what they were now. He wasn't asking her to change, just to allow him in. To let him see her, truly see her. She bit her lip, torn between the part of her that wanted to run and the part of her that longed to take a chance, to let herself be more than the maid, more than the woman hidden behind a facade of shyness and self-doubt. I don't know, she said again, but this time, it was more to herself than to him. Nelson nodded, his expression understanding. He didn't press her further, but he didn't step back either. Take your time, Emma. But know this, whenever you're ready, I'll be here. With that, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing down the hall, leaving Emma standing alone in the vast space, her thoughts a whirlwind. The next few days felt like an eternity. Every time Emma saw Nelson, she felt that familiar pull, the longing in her chest that she couldn't shake. It was becoming harder to ignore the feelings that were growing inside her. But she still wasn't sure. Could she truly open herself up to someone like him? Could she trust him enough to let him see her, flaws and all? The opportunity came sooner than she expected. It was a rainy evening, and the estate was quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by the soft patter of raindrops against the windows. Emma was finishing up in the kitchen, wiping dew down the countertops, when Nelson appeared at the door. He was wearing a dark coat, his hair slightly damp from the rain, and his presence seemed to fill the room. I'm not interrupting, am I? He asked, his voice low, almost tentative. No, not at all, Emma replied, startled by his sudden appearance but trying to hide the flutter of nerves that spread through her. She forced herself to focus on the task in front of her, not wanting him to see how much his presence affected her. Nelson took a step closer, his eyes not leaving her. I thought you might want some company. It's a quiet night, and I'd like to spend some time with you. No formalities. Just, us. Her heart skipped at the simple words. He wasn't asking her to be anyone she wasn't. He just wanted her. Emma felt a rush of emotions, but she quickly pushed them back down. Could she do this? Could she take that step? I don't know what to say, she confessed, her voice trembling slightly as she met his gaze. Nelson smiled, a soft, almost amused smile. You don't have to say anything. Just come with me. Without waiting for a response, he reached out and gently took her hand, guiding her through the grand halls of the estate. Emma's breath caught at the warmth of his touch, the way his fingers gently curled around hers as though it were the most natural thing in the world. They walked in silence, their steps echoing in the vast, empty spaces of the mansion. As they reached a small, cozy sitting room by the fire, Nelson turned to face her. You're not alone here, Emma, he said softly, his voice low but earnest. And you don't have to hide from me anymore. Whatever you need, whenever you're ready. I'm here. There it was again, the invitation. His offer wasn't just about being with her in the present. It was a promise for the future. A future where she wouldn't have to hide. Emma felt her walls begin to crumble, piece by piece. She had fought so hard to keep herself distant from this world, from Nelson, but now, standing in front of him, she realized she couldn't keep running. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. For the first time in a long time, she looked at Nelson, not as her employer, not as the powerful man who held all the control, but as a person. A man who saw her. Who cared. And, maybe, just maybe, she could allow herself to care in return. "I don't know what this means yet," she said quietly, her voice soft but clear. "But I'll try. I'll try to let you in." Nelson's eyes softened with warmth, and for a moment, he didn't speak, just let the silence fill the space between them. And in that silence, Emma knew that everything was changing. Whether she was ready or not. The days following that moment felt surreal to Emma. She found herself growing increasingly aware of Nelson's presence in her life, not just as her employer, but as someone who genuinely cared for her. The interactions between them became more frequent, though still innocent, filled with moments of
shared smiles, lingering gazes, and quiet conversations that seemed to hold more meaning than what was said. Nelson never pressured her. He didn't rush her to open up. Instead, he allowed her the space to come to terms with her feelings. And though Emma was still hesitant, there was something undeniable about the way he made her feel, alive, seen, wanted. A feeling she'd never imagined would come from someone like him. One evening, as the soft glow of sunset filtered through the windows of the estate, Emma found herself in the living room, reading a book. It had become one of her favorite pastimes to unwind after a long day of work, though she never felt entirely at peace in the quiet of the house. There was always a tension in the air, a silent anticipation. Nelson entered the room without warning, his footsteps light but deliberate. Emma looked up, startled by his sudden appearance. "You're reading again," he said, a playful note in his voice. He took a step closer, his gaze fixed on the book she was holding. "What's this one about?" She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she wanted to share the contents of the book with him. It'd for or something personal, a romance novel she'd picked up months ago, a fantasy world far removed from her reality. But something about Nelson made her want to share, made her feel like he wouldn't judge her. "It's a love story," Emma said softly, closing the book and glancing up at him. "I guess I've always been curious about love, the kind that's not just about convenience or necessity." Nelson raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Love that's not about necessity? What do you mean by that?" Emma took a deep breath, her fingers gently tracing the edges of the book. "In my life, love has always seemed practical. I've never really experienced it the way people talk about in stories. The kind that sweeps you off your feet, that makes you feel like you could do anything for the other person." Nelson's expression softened, and he moved closer, sitting on the edge of the sofa next to her. "And what if you could? What if love wasn't something to be afraid of, something that didn't have to make sense but just was?" Emma looked up at him, her heart racing. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It seems impossible, like it's meant for someone else." Nelson didn't respond immediately, but his gaze remained fixed on hers. There was a stillness in the air, a quiet connection that neither of them had ever acknowledged aloud. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice almost a whisper. "You're wrong, Emma," he said, his tone soft but firm. "Love isn't something that only happens to other people. It's for everyone, if they're willing to accept it. And you deserve it. You deserve to be loved in a way that's pure, that's real." Emma swallowed hard, his words washing over her like a warm tide. She wanted to believe him, but there was a part of her that held back, a part of her that still doubted she was worthy
of that kind of love. "Nelson," she started, but she didn't know what to say next. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as though everything she had guarded for years was being laid bare in front of him. He reached out then, his hand brushing against hers, sending a shiver down her spine. "I'm not going anywhere, Emma. You don't have to rush this. But I need you to know something, I'm here. I'm not just some man who's passing through your life. I'm here because I see you. I want to know you. All of you." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Emma felt her heart beat faster, the weight of his honesty settling deep within her. Could she let him in? Could she trust him with the parts of her that no one else had ever seen? As if sensing her inner conflict, Nelson gave her a reassuring smile. "We don't have to figure it all out tonight. But I want you to know that you don't have to be afraid of what's growing between us." Emma looked at him, her breath catching in her throat. "I don't know how to let go of the fear," she admitted quietly. "I've always been afraid of being hurt." "Afraid of? Of what?" Nelson prompted gently, his hand still resting near hers. "Afraid of being something I'm not," she whispered. "Afraid of trusting someone who has everything, someone who can have anyone. I don't know how I fit into that." Nelson leaned in slightly, his voice quiet but filled with warmth. "You fit, Emma. You fit more than you know. All I'm asking is for you to let me show you." The tension between them seemed to dissolve in that moment, and Emma felt a strange peace wash over her. Maybe she wasn't ready for the kind of love she'd always read about in books, but maybe, just maybe, she was ready to take a chance on the love she could feel growing between her and Nelson. The days following the gala felt like a blur to Emma. There were moments of joy, fleeting but precious, where she felt truly connected to Nelson, moments where the world seemed to shrink, and only the two of them mattered. Yet, those moments were always followed by a gnawing fear in her gut, a fear that kept her from fully allowing herself to be vulnerable. Nelson was patient, never pushing too hard, always there when she needed him, but Emma couldn't escape the nagging doubts that swirled in her mind. She wasn't like the women Nelson was used to. She wasn't from his world of wealth and privilege. She was just the maid, the girl who cleaned the rooms, served the food, and stayed out of the way. What could he possibly see in her that could last? One evening, as Emma was preparing dinner in the kitchen, she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find Nelson standing there, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something else, something urgent. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "I need to talk to you, Emma," he said softly, stepping into the room without waiting for her to respond. She closed the door behind him, her heart beating faster at his serious tone. "What is it?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel, suddenly nervous. "I can't stop thinking about you," Nelson admitted, his voice low. "I know you're scared, and I know I'm asking a lot, but I need to know if we can make this work. If you can trust me." Emma's throat tightened, and she glanced away, struggling to hold back the emotions that threatened to spill over. "I don't know how to trust you, Nelson. I don't know how to trust anyone, especially someone like you." "Someone like me?" His voice softened, and he took a step closer. "What does that mean?" "I'm just a maid, Nelson," she whispered. "You're a billionaire. You're used to getting whatever you want, and I'm just me. I don't belong in your world." "That's where you're wrong," he said, his voice earnest. "You belong in my world because I want you there. This is about us, Emma. Not about power, not about money. This is about trust, and what we could build together." Emma shook her head, tears threatening to fall. "But how do we make that work? How do we make this, whatever this is, work when everything about us is so different?" Nelson reached out, gently lifting her chin so that their eyes met. "We take it one day at a time. We build it together. I don't expect you to have all the answers, but I'm asking you to take a chance on us. Take a chance on me." The sincerity in his gaze made her heart skip a beat. She felt the walls she had so carefully constructed around herself begin to crumble. For the first time, she realized that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to be vulnerable with him. Maybe it was okay to trust him. "I'm scared, Nelson," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared that if I let myself fall for you, I'll get hurt. That it will end, and I'll be left with nothing. Nelson's face softened, and he gently cupped her face in his hands. You won't be left with nothing, Emma. I promise you, I will never let you fall without catching you. This isn't about just one of us. It's about both of us, together. The raw honesty in his voice pierced through her defenses, and Emma felt something inside her shift. It wasn't an instant transformation, but it was the first step, a fragile, tentative step toward trusting him, toward allowing herself to believe that maybe she could be more than just a maid in his eyes. I want to believe you, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. And I'll show you, every day, that you can, he replied. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments of growing connection. Nelson was patient, never pushing Emma beyond what she was ready for. They spent time together outside of the grand world of his business dealings, exploring parts of the city where they could be just two people, no titles, no expectations. As they got to know each other more, Emma found herself falling into a rhythm with Nelson, something that felt natural, as if they had always been meant to be in each other's lives. She started to share things she hadn't told anyone, her childhood, her dreams, her fears. Nelson listened without judgment, always supportive, always present. One evening, as they sat in the cozy living room of his mansion, Emma found herself laughing at a joke Nelson had told, her head resting against his shoulder. The sound of her laughter filled the room, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly at ease. Nelson smiled, his arm around her shoulders. You're beautiful when you laugh, he said softly. Emma's heart fluttered at his words, and she looked up at him. I never thought I'd be here, with you, like this, she confessed. This wasn't the life I imagined for myself. Maybe we can build a new life together, Nelson said, his voice steady but filled with an underlying hope. The moment hung in the air between them, a quiet promise that neither of them was quite ready to say out loud, but both could feel deep in their hearts. For the first time, Emma didn't feel like she was out of place. She felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the weeks went on, Emma and Nelson grew closer. The relationship was no longer defined by power or wealth but by something deeper, a mutual respect, understanding, and a connection neither of them had expected. But the outside world was never far away, and there were still challenges ahead. They would have to face the prejudices of society, the secrets Nelson had yet to reveal, and the fears Emma still carried. But for now, in this moment, all that mattered was the quiet trust they were building, step by step, together. And as Nelson held her close that night, Emma realized that maybe, just maybe, love could bloom between a billionaire and his maid. It would take time, it would take courage, but she was willing to take the risk. Because for the first time, she didn't feel like she was just a maid in his world, she felt like she was a part of it. And maybe that was enough.